That's not how that works. Get any hints or
Well,
anything.
why
I just
not?
think it has to be mid. What do you
You
mean?
think
Why
it's
not?
just
Only so
everyone's
many.
just locked into the tier that they're locked in to,
No,
or
but no, but a huge percent are locked in to that tier. That there can only be so many tier one players. That's how tier one works. What's up, guys? I've got one of my competitors with me today, at least whenever I feel like playing high rollers. But he's played quite a few more, done a little bit better than I have. He's won nearly 32 million in high rollers, and before that, he already had quite some success, making a couple million or so in online tournaments, to my understanding. What's up, Daniel Dvoress?
hey, Jungle. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, not much in Cyprus right now on one of my live tournament journeys.
Yeah, well, Cyprus is pretty sweet. I don't blame you. Tempted to go there. I knew that you started off online. Was there any specific reason why you switched from online to live? Was it just the money? Did you like it more? I don't know. Well, I don't hate. I'm not a big fan of online tournaments.
Um, I mean, I think a few reasons. I've always bounced around a variety of online games. Like I started playing sit and goes, then I mostly switched over to cash. Then as there became more and more issues, in my view, with online cash, just such as intense bum hunting, scripting, etc. I just didn't really like that environment. I gradually moved to online tournaments. And from there, it was just a natural progression into live tournaments as I was playing higher and higher stakes. And eventually, I just switched over to almost exclusively live tournaments just because a lot of the issues that I find with online games are either non existent or existent to a lesser extent in the live scene.
That's a fair point. I mean, it is. I see plenty about money, to be honest. Though, and tournaments, you still. I mean, it's going to be hard for those to disappear anytime soon. Do you think I read that you think that online is kind of dying out. Do you still think that? And also, on a related note, do you think there's a high degree of cheating compared to what was going on in the past? Because when I played, I mean, I play online sometimes, but I don't play that much. I didn't really get the impression people were colluding or anything like that, or at least I wasn't picking up on it. What are your thoughts on that?
Lots of thoughts. So, yeah, there's kind of two separate questions, like that are somewhat related. Like, first of all, is online drying out as a whole? And then, is there cheating? And to answer the first question, so is online drying out? I think when you look at specifically online high stakes, what the answer to that is yes, except for a few niche situations where there is one or two games running around someone, right? So if you're able to get in at the right place and time to be able to play those games, then no, online is not dry. But aside from those like very niche sort of pockets, it's hard to find a bunch of like 25, 50 cash games to play nowadays, right? So in that sense, I think it's drying out a little bit. To answer the question of do I think there is more cheating online now? I think there's when it comes to cheating, I think it can be kind of separated into two distinct buckets, like sort of kind of like soft cheating and hard cheating. And I want to be careful with the use soft cheating because it doesn't make it any better. But what I consider that to be is like looking at charts, for example, right? Or using real time assistance, where you are stealing very real EV from your opponents, But it is a different sort of category of cheating than sitting at a table with your friend and card sharing or squeezing people actively out of pots, right?
I agree. I personally think it exists on a gradient, and if you take this logic to its extreme, one realization that I had is that people actually cheat each other all the time in real life, although it's never really spoken about. For example, when someone takes like a VIP out of the game, and it's like an unspoken rule that you're not supposed to do that, commonly known etiquette, that is effectively cheating, even though it doesn't like fit the precise format of like a game. At least it's not officially a game, is what I mean to say. That is still it's still cheating. It's still stealing from this group of people, and there's other variations of that that are far more subtle. Um, so I mean, I actually took the very extreme route and went 100% deciding, okay, none of this is okay. I mean, you could even go as far as to say any form of like what can be considered angle shoot. I mean, let me ask you if you agree with it, actually, before I present go to
Sure.
what do you agree with what I'm saying or no?
Um, I mean, well, clarify what you're saying first, because yeah, I just think the gradient is well, like such a gradient. Like to give you an example, like if you could relate it to this, like looking at charts in real time while you're playing, clearly not okay. I think we would both
Yes.
agree on that, and I think anyone that I play with would agree on that. But then, what if you are looking at charts on tournament break? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Um,
That's okay.
you think that's okay? What if you take a picture of the stacks of the first hand that you are coming back to in an online tournament, and you walk away from your computer and you input those stacks on tournament break and get an answer for that first hand? Is that okay?
That's okay. Yeah.
That but well, what if you do it for every subsequent hand in real time?
You can't do it for a subsequent hand. How would you do that? You're playing. You're already in the game. Now you're in the game. When you're in the game, you can't do this
Right, but what makes it okay for doing it for hand one, right?
because you were on break. And let's see. I think there can be like some. I think it's really a fine line once we're like in between hands. I would use since it's so fine line, and there's no like official ruling, it's probably okay to be honest. In between hands, but not in the hand. Like there has to be a point where you can exercise your option because that's kind of the point of a game, right? It kind of gets to this line between exercising your option to the point of fairness, and this line is fairness, and then going over the line where now you're stealing. But I mean, like it seems like if you brush up against this line, you're occasionally gonna go over here a little bit, actually. But
Right,
I still
and
think
that's kind of my point, right? It's like on such a gradient where you would agree that basically doing a lookup for hand one, as long as it's after a break, is kind of okay. But then if hand two takes a really long time and you have time to do it while someone else is playing out hand two and you're doing it for hand three after break, then that's like not okay. Arbitrary line. It's a gradient. Like kind of hard to answer where the right line is, right?
I think it's while you're playing. You can't look it up while you're playing. You can't like get the answer to the question while you're playing. But if you're not in the hand, you're not really playing. I would personally argue you can look up something while you're not playing. Like you could even like ask. That's the same as that's like saying asking someone. Like you'd have to then say that asking someone a question after a hand is cheating too to get like an answer. Like that would be the conclusion of that logic. I would think because like if you can't like if you're I would just think it has to be mid hand. Mid hand you can't look up any information or get any hints or anything like that. That's kind of been the status quo for how this works. No talking to the hand, blah blah blah, or no giving talking about the hand or talking strategy during the hand, that kind of thing. That's my personal view.
Yeah. Let me just kind of give you a hypothetical example. I'm on the button with 10 big blinds. Sorry, I'm in the big blind with 10 big blinds at a final table. And, hijack opens, cutoff calls. I fold, they go post flop. Hand takes a while. While this hand is taking place, I stand up from the table. I walk to my friend on the rail and I ask him what my strategy folded to in the small blind should be for the next hand. Like I would say that's clearly not okay. Even though kind of like using your logic, it's like maybe okay, and I agree, it is kind of like this sort of weird gray area.
I would say in gray areas, you should probably, if it's clear, if it's very unofficial, probably take the aggressive approach. I personally would not count that as cheating, and I certainly wouldn't count it as like something worth like, grabbing your pitchforks for. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
And so actually, I've extended this logic beyond just poker, and I believe it very much does. It kind of through a few life experiences, and this is kind of what I was getting at. But you can, and even within the context of poker, you can take this logic, and now you can say, there's the example I gave. Well, do you agree with the example of like taking a player from the game when it's status quo? You don't take a player from the game. Like for example, like that's effectively a version of cheating. Like now you're taking value from everyone else.
um I mean, it depends what the status quo is. That's kind of why I gave the example of like asking my strategy for the next hand from someone in the rail. Like, there is not necessarily a clear agreement on whether that's okay or not. And if there was, then there would be a clear answer. I don't know what the clear status quo is in your example. If it's clearly agreed upon that it's not okay to do that, then yeah, I would say it's not okay. However, cash games around VIPs, they are based on a bunch of social dynamics. One of the reasons that they're not personally very appealing to me. And so those are always kind of tricky. So I don't know. Is there a clearly defined status quo?
Well, personally thinking about this stuff, I basically came to the conclusion that it kind of boiled down to all versions of energy, for lack of a better word, intention, same thing, directed towards taking something from someone else that is not rightfully yours, that's not like justably okay, is effectively, you could call it cheating, call it unethical. It's all basically the same. That's basically the conclusion I came to. And then personally, I went down the extreme route and said, okay, well, none of this is okay. I'm going to try to be as perfect to the line as I possibly can to maximize my own EV in the present form. That's what that represents. That's like kind of, I mean, you could call that justice for oneself, I would think. But I went real philosophical and deep into this. I don't know if you agree with that, but I could give you another example. I'm trying to think. Let me think of one. I mean, I would go as far as saying that one example would be if you're a little bit too rude or angry towards someone else, it's like sort of like cheating the dynamic because you're essentially taking uh, energy from someone else's good day, so you can feel a little bit better. If you see what I'm saying, uh, any of this make any sense to you? Do you agree at
Yeah.
all? Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure I necessarily um, agree with the conclusion. I'd have to think about it more. But yeah, of course, what you're saying makes total sense to me. Although in your particular example, it's not like a zero sum game where if you get angry at someone, you take energy from them, you are automatically to feel better. That sounds like an example of like a negative sum situation where you're an asshole to someone, you take energy from them, and then actually uh, you just feel worse after as well. So everyone's kind of at a loss there.
And I would say, continuing that example, you would temporarily feel better, and then you might feel worse, and you realize, oh, you need to correct it. That would be good if you felt worse, and then you would realize, okay, I want to balance things out. That would be like part of the byproduct, I would think. But that
Yeah.
gets really, I don't know if it really works that way. Maybe it just inevitably you end up feeling worse somehow. I don't personally know, but I personally took this stuff to like crazy extremes where I realized that the dynamic between taking and the idea of cheating or stealing or whatever didn't just fall into the framework of a poker game. You could apply the idea of a poker game or game where people take or don't take to other things as well. But Unless you want to talk about that, we'll talk more about poker stuff that isn't too. That's my own personal stuff. Uh, that I think. I mean, one thing I want to ask you is, do you think there's like enough room even for like quite a few more high stakes poker players? And related to that, have you even investigated outside of the mainstream events in other markets like Asia and that kind of thing?
Is there more room for poker players at the high stakes? Yeah, I would say so. I think that right now, like if you're speaking about high roller tournaments specifically, what I would evaluate the current environment as is it is gradually getting depolarized. And the way that I see these sort of, yeah, like the way that I see these player pools go is kind of like this almost ebb and flow where uh, you go through a period of polarity where there's really, really good players and then a few recreational players who are not so good. And then you get an influx of players that are kind of less good than the elite players. And that kind of uh, persists for a period of time. And I think that currently we are in that sort of zone where the player pool is, at least in my view, a lot more depolarized. And I think in an environment like that, there is certainly an opportunity for someone new to come in because what will happen is in a year or two, some of those under the first tier, under the first, second tier players will inevitably drop away. And then you can kind of replace those and perhaps become a new top tier player in the new polarized pool a few years from now. That's kind of how I guess, philosophically picture the high stakes scene. But of course, there's so many other factors too. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my view on that.
So you're saying it polarizes a bit and then it depolarizes and then polarizes again based on various factors?
Yeah, because if the player pool gets very polarized, then usually the ratio of Rex to pros is pretty good, and realistically, the edge that you could get, especially like a short stack no limit, as someone elite on someone that's a little bit less than elite, is pretty small nowadays. So you get into this situation where player pool is very polarized. Great opportunity for someone. I use the word mediocre loosely. Mediocre would still mean like very good, just maybe not elite. But good opportunity for someone like that to come in and take some EV. But then if a lot of people like that come in, then the players at the top are still doing fine, but it's now the player pool is too saturated, and eventually within a couple of years, there's a pecking order between like all the kind of second tier players, and a lot of them drop away.
Sure, sure, okay. Well, you would know better than me. I at least when it comes to tournaments, I haven't hung around too much in the tournament scene. Um, what do you think it takes to reach these kind of levels? Do you think it's like an intense amount of commitment, or does someone have some talent they don't have to focus quite as hard? It just requires a lot of commitment in general.
A lot of commitment and a lot of execution. I think I know quite a few players that are quite talented and really know what's going on technically, but just have a little bit of a hard time executing consistently under high pressure spots. And I think that's something, execution, I think, is something that can certainly be improved with the correct kind of training and practice. But there is also, uh, I think, a how you're wired component to it too. Some people are just a little more cold blooded than others, which I think, and I mean that like in a good way. I think that's a good trait in terms of being able to execute when you're consistently being put into some of the highest stake spots in your life.
Sure, to not let your emotions fluster you is, I
Yeah.
guess, what you're saying. Um, and I wonder if what those practices look like, and if GTO Lab may have something to do with those practices or other practices. Because I just realized now that you're part of GTO Lab, I didn't know.
Yeah. GTO Lab, I would say, is more geared towards, well, certainly it will be something that's useful to elite high stakes players and the top tier players for sure. But really, we're trying to bridge the gap between publicly available tools and being able to actually use them and make sense of them for anything between like more casual players to pros who are less seasoned to using tools. Because the way that I see the uh, software and the trainer environment right now is that there's basically coaching sites that make videos, and then there are sites with solutions, be it pre-flop or post-flop, and there's really nothing in between to bridge the gap. And you actually have to be quite a sophisticated user to make the most out of whatever outputs you're looking at, be it pre-flop or post-flop, especially when it comes to tournaments, because situations are so nuanced, and we're kind of trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, okay, yeah. It seems like a tough gap to bridge. I know there's a couple other people groups trying to work on that as well. Um, I don't know if you know about your what are they, competitors? I feel like
Competitors,
there's a word I'm missing. Yeah, but
rivals,
rivals.
enemies.
Yeah. Probably frenemies, I would say, because I
Yeah.
know I don't even know if I should mention or not. Um, there's at least I'm pretty sure there's multiple groups working on that, but I hope someone succeeds. Could be you. I want to
Yeah.
ask, what's that?
Just yeah, I don't think it's like kind of us or them sort of thing either. Realistically, I think that we're at a point in time where not even with just poker, but even with like online streaming services, people have multiple subscriptions. And I think when it comes to coaching sites or sites with solutions, the price point is such that if you're someone that plays poker seriously, you should probably have a subscription to multiple things. And then over time, you'll probably gradually be using one more than the other, and then you can kind of revise. But the price point with any of these isn't really so high that people shouldn't have a subscription to multiple options. So I don't even see it as like a zero sum game sort of thing. Sure, there's some competition, but I also think that there's quite a lot of space for everyone in the industry.
Sure, sure. Right. Usually these things don't purely boil down to who's got the best product or whatever. They boil down to a few different things. Well, let me ask you this: what do you expect? Let's say most like 25K MTT players to make. Suppose someone's like solidly beating a 25K, like that's probably like pretty high level. Even though I think we can both agree that those ones are quite a lot softer than 100Ks usually. Um,
Mm-hmm.
let's say they like had half their action for those, and they're playing 10Ks or whatever, and like, oops, they're playing some high stakes cash games. What do you think they're making a year? I want to know more about what your edge is over those kinds of guys.
So so the question is like how much I think a tier one player would make in kind of playing 25Ks, or someone a little bit below that.
Some a little bit below that because tier one's too ambitious. Not everyone can be tier one.
Mm-hmm.
Only what, like 10% or so can be tier one. That's how tier one works.
Yeah.
So more like, or 10, I don't know how you're rating it, 10 to 20%, probably top 15%. Um, yeah, so more like solidly winning, the typical one, because it's not realistic to aim for tier one.
Right. So if you're beating a 25k for, let's say, 4 to 5% on average,
You think that's tier
and
two? Four to
yeah,
five percent.
yeah, and then you have roughly half your auction. So, you're making something like $400 or $500 a tournament. Um,
That sounds not very good.
well, it's not amazing, but I should say you're making $400 to $500 per bullet, not per tournament. Or another way to look at it is, you can make the calculation a lot simpler and just kind of tally up how much action you put in a given year. So let's say you have 5 million in buy-ins. If you kind of travel to everything, play a lot, and let's say you have a 2% ROI in that. Uh, Plus, you'd be selling a little bit at markup. You're still in the six figures. The markup that you're getting is kind of like a base salary. So, yeah, I mean, it's not. I think being a tier two player in the live tournament scene is not an easy living by any means, or a great living. But ultimately, I don't think it's an ends to a mean. I think most of the people that are in that sort of tier two bucket, really what they're trying to do is to become a tier one player. Where I
Yeah, but
think,
that can happen. That's not how that works.
well, why not? You, you,
What do you
you
mean?
think
Why
it's
not?
just
Only so
everyone's
many.
just locked into the tier that they're locked in to,
No,
or
but no, but a huge percent are locked in to that tier. There can only be so many tier one players. That's how tier one works.
right? Um, yeah, but the ambition is to still progress and make it out of that tier, right? And if you can't, if you can't, and your EV is 200k a year, let's say, or 150k a year, and you've hit your ceiling, and your ceiling is truly to be a tier two player, I don't think that there's that many opportunities in poker for you to be making like double that amount anyway, right?
Well, I don't know if I agree. And I personally have a different approach. I don't like this whole idea of, I mean, I've talked about it before, but I don't like this whole idea of let's try to be top player because it's super hard to do that, first of all. But there are other ways that I think, and it kind of does remind me of a fallacy that I read about in other industries. Well, it's not exactly the same thing, but basically, yeah, I mean, not everyone can be tier one. It sounds like kind of miserable, and and it even has a parallel in business, which is that competition sucks if you have to compete in this kind of way, unless you just really do have some kind of talent, which I don't know how you would identify. I would personally look for other opportunities to make more money while doing that. I think it's important to have a bit more of a flexible approach rather than be like kind of locked in there. And yeah, I've said that before. I found opportunities quite a bit. I mean, looking around and not looking around. I actually tried to do that's part of the point of my community is to make more to look to get people to look for more of these opportunities and kind of like fall into them more rather than sit there and battle each other out. I just think that's not really a winning situation. Um, I mean, that's not bad money. It's not what I expected. What does a tier one player make? I would have thought a tier one player makes like 30%, to be honest, but maybe I'm just out of it, dude.
30%. Well, in what sort of tournament? In a
25K.
10k, sure. In a 25k, it'd have to be a very soft one. I think there are certainly several 25ks a year that I play where I might be about that. Although I think that is a fairly high estimate, but sure, there are several 25ks in a given year that I play where I'm comfortable saying, it's like a 20% ROI, maybe better spot. Uh, but you'd be looking at a lot lower, sub 10% ROIs once you get into the 50s and the hundreds. But you can also reasonably get something like, nowadays 6-8 million in buy-ins in a year. So your ROI is going to be higher at the lower buy-ins, a little bit lower at the higher buy-ins, but on average, let's say you're making something like 8 to 10%. You're clearing over 500,000 a year in EV. If you're there. And I agree. Yeah, even if you are a tier 1 player, you should be looking for other opportunities, other ways to make money. The only thing that I would um, kind of point out is if you are kind of in the not top tier, but maybe battling it out, I don't think it's that losing of a situation because I think it's such a good learning opportunity. If you have blinders on and you're kind of okay, I'm tier 2 now, but I'm gonna make it tier 1 in a year or two, and if I don't, I'm a complete failure and my life is miserable. Then yeah, you're gonna be miserable. But I think if you find a way to enjoy the process and come out better at the end of it, you're still gonna be a way better poker player if you're super competitive. If it didn't work in a couple of years, that's okay. You can still do other things in poker, and yeah, you should always be looking for other things regardless.
Sure. Well, I got a question. How are you assessing this? How are you assessing the EV of the tournaments? I know that almost certainly people are over assessing their EVs in these tournaments. But I don't know how to really assess the EVs of these tournaments.
Well, I would say the real answer is that there's a bunch of people guessing. I am one
That's a
of
great
those
start.
people. But there are, but I'm fortunate to be friends with many people that are smarter than me, whose guesses I trust a little bit more than my own, and their guesses tend to be fairly close to what my guesses are. So, look, the real answer is yeah, we're all kind of trying to handicap these things, and it's people guessing. That's why it's called gambling. I don't like. Yeah, there's not supposed to be an answer, right? If there was a clear answer, this guy's winning 18%, this guy's losing 34.
I mean, you could
Why
like
would we play?
you could you could I mean, it is possible that someone could just to think of why they would do this. Someone could get paid to figure out what everyone plays and that kind of thing, and you know, give some kind of assessment for what each regular or player is in the tournament, like whether one's a VIP or like a casual player or one's a regular player or whatever, or some bad regular who won a satellite or one's Daniel Dvoress, and, and you could compare them to other online tournaments perhaps, and then like that would give you probably a good idea. There's ways of using data. We have data now. We're like data people, right? So I would think
Yeah,
that's possible. Just wondering what the incentives are of that. Actually, what you could do is give that to like people who buy action and sell it. Like, I don't know how much money there is in that.
yeah. I think so. You could do that, and look, people, especially people in the action buying business, do that. One of the issues with that is that by the time you get a big enough sample, especially when it comes to live tournaments, by the time you get a big enough sample, you are sampling games that are so far in the past that there is very little to do with being able to actually predict a game that is tomorrow, both because the players level that you're kind of questioning has changed, but also the player pool itself is completely different. So uh, yes, you can kind of say, oh, well, you can get like mass data, but when you kind of look at it, it's like, well, can you? Uh, you need a lot of data for things to converge when it comes to tournaments.
I still think it's possible, but whatever. Maybe I'll explore that idea at some point. I want to ask, what is it that makes you superior to your common tier two players
Uh,
besides just hard work? We've had that answer
it's a
before.
bit of a loaded
Some real
question.
answers here.
Uh,
Unless you're not a tier two player, are you? I
I
don't
hope
think you
not.
are. I think you're a tier one player.
Yeah, I hope not.
$32 million dollars is no joke, man.
So I think I'm a little bit better at being able to execute, and actually probably weaker if you just gave me a poker test of some like complex spots, um, and then you had some guys that are kind of like tier two taking that same test, and I think that some of those guys would actually score higher than me. So I'm not someone that is particularly precise, but I think that I'm able to internalize the gist of a situation really well. I'm able to execute really well, uh, and I'm also quite strong at finding my way through novel spots. Which, if you think about it, depending on how granular you are, every tournament spot is some new tournament spot because there's just an infinite amount of like stack distributions and arrangements that you could be into. The payouts are always slightly different.
Aren't they all like
Risk
on a
premiums are different.
continuum? Aren't
Hmm?
they all, yeah, but aren't they, you know what I mean, like pots on a continuum? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yeah.
It's not like you get into, the Twilight Zone too much where someone like actually takes a line that is wildly different. It's oh, what do you do when you're 25 big blinds and now there's a 35 big blind stack and he's not as aggressive as he should versus opens. Like, you know what I mean? It's like not that far away from a lot of your other spots.
Yeah, it is generally on a continuum and not that far away from other spots. But what happens is, especially in smaller fields, there tend to come up spots where it's quite nuanced and one particular factor influences where you are along that continuum a lot. So, like, let's say some spot where you're opening a 25 big blind stack into two 30 big blind stacks, and here now you're opening into a 35 big blind stack and a 38 big blind stack. And then you're kind of going, okay, well, maybe it'll be a bit tighter. But then also in this spot, the min cash is 2.8 buy-ins instead of your regular 1.8 or something. And in some situations, especially like in a bubble spot, that will be extremely important and will shift where you are along that continuum quite strongly. In other spots, you can actually evaluate it based on being close to another situation that just based on the stack sizes. And I would say my strengths are at being able to assess the nuances of a situation and kind of figure out what's important and relate it to something that I know. And I think some weaker players they kind of get blinders on and only look at one or two of the factors and occasionally miss a third factor that happens to be important in this particular situation.
Can you give an example?
Um, an ICM example. So, like an ICM example would be, where a particular stack distribution, but pay the min cache is a lot bigger, so the pay jump is a lot smaller. Something that happens quite often, especially in like smaller 40, 50 player fields where it's something like 6 pay, and the min cache is quite large. If you're used to studying spots where the min cache is 2 buy-ins or less, it won't necessarily translate very well to this sort of spot. To give a completely different example, if you are in a spot where the EV of future hands happens to be extremely important, you want to deviate quite a bit from what an ICM solution might give you. And I think that a lot of people that know ICM solutions quite well, they are so deep into those ICM sims that they kind of forget that there's, um, you're studying essentially what's a good estimate of what's essentially like a good estimate, an approximation based on a pretty fake model, and they kind of lose sight of the bigger picture, and they're precise with knowing outputs, but not good at adjusting based on the EV of future hands that you might play in a particular stack distribution.
Sure. Do you have an example of one of these future game situations where it's more relevant than the ICM models would say?
Sure. No limit or short deck.
Let's say no limit. Most
Yeah,
of
no
the
limit probably
options are going to play no limit.
transfers over well. So a really easy example would be something like if we are in a situation where, let's say, it's there's three left in a tournament, normal payout structures, everyone is pretty short, and 10 big blind stack folds on the button, 20 big blind stack shoves on you from the small blind, and you have 10 big blinds in the big blind. So what you would what the ICM model is not considering there is that if you play as the ICM model indicates, then your stack is actually worth a lot less than what the 10 big blind stack is, because as you play more and more orbits, you're not going to be able to VPIP. The chip leader is going to keep shoving. Your stack's going to keep dwindling down. On the flip side, if you call off wider than the ICM model and you do happen to double, now you're in that situation where you're the 20 big blind stack, everything has flipped, and you get to grind down the other uh, two stacks. Really simple, kind of basic example, but that's an example of something that is not really captured in ICM models, and where I think the adjustments accounting for future games can actually be quite drastic.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. Uh, yeah, I think a lot of players will, or if they're listening, they'll get to the point they'll find that useful. Um, yeah, I guess thinking about stuff like that can make a lot of things quite subtle. I thought a lot of players, to be honest, didn't know ICM super well based off of what I had seen myself. But it doesn't seem that hard to have kind of a good idea of what you're doing. 'Cause I looked at ICM in another game, PLO. It didn't seem like there were that many surprises. But it sounds like you're saying that a lot of people do know the ICM sims pretty well.
I think a lot of people know the outputs to ICM sims really well, but a lot of the people that know the outputs really well actually tend to be quite poor judges of when those outputs are accurate in real life and when they're a little bit off because of other considerations. This would take me back probably more than a decade now. Yeah, more than a decade, like back to my six max sit and go days. But one thing that became obvious quite quickly, from playing kind of these fast structure sit and goes where there's a lot of push fold, and a lot of the spots are kind of, they repeat over and over. It's always kind of like the same payouts, same number of chips at the table. So it's kind of easy to learn what an equilibrium looks like in a particular spot. But I would notice that the biggest winners, they would for sure purposely not adhere to the ICM outputs in every spot. So yeah, any like what I'm saying about kind of future games, the ICM model being fake, it's not anything new. People figured this out more than a decade ago, and the best players adjusted.
Okay. have there been any uh, softwares that capture a future game very well? I mean, this seems like something GTO Lab could make a course on, perhaps, actually.
So with current software that's available, if you're looking at something like the Hold'em Resources Calculator, there is a future game. There is future game functionality. It is somewhat limited, both in terms of the aspect of running enough future hands in advance, especially at tables with many players. It's just the game tree gets way too big. And then there's also the issue of what model are you using for the future hands that you are playing. And currently, for the future hands, you're just using the ICM model anyway. So there there is stuff out there that captures a little bit of it. When you look at kind of especially toy game situations, things move in a direction that would be intuitive as like an experienced human, in terms of being looser in specific spots compared to ICM. I think there's several people or groups of people that are working on more complex ways to tackle this future game issue. Maybe something that we'll see in a couple of years, but it's a complex question because essentially to get a real answer, you have to play out the whole tournament from whatever node you're at, and
Probably
you know,
approximate. There's probably like a number of hands where it really matter. You just probably maybe calculate 20% of the hands or something, or 30% of the next hands, and then at some point, I would just think like the further the hands are in the game, the less they really have much effect. Especially if, yeah, I think that's true. But what do I know? I just assume there's some kind of like math that happens to follow this pattern. Um, Let me ask you this: what is in the future for Daniel Dvoress? Is it more poker tournaments, or you're going to do something else? It sounded like before you're really in poker for the love of the game. Uh, I remember, we were talking about. We were also talking about doing something for a positive purpose and that sort of thing. Uh, what kind of plans you got?
so for the near future, definitely poker. Uh, I just yeah, I love being competitive. I love playing at the highest stakes. I just love poker. I've also started learning PLO recently, which I've really been um, enjoying in a masochistic sort of way, because it's so hard, and I just realize how bad I am. So definitely a lot more poker in the future. Also a lot of GTO lab stuff in the future, and I think in the far future, I think I'll probably gradually start moving away from poker. But the way I see it is, in some form, poker's always going to be a part of my life.
It's fair enough. I think it's a bit of a challenge to move away from poker totally. Um, PLO is a good option for poker players for no limit. I always advise people to. I advise at least the people who I'm trying to help in the community to. I would say for them to learn PLO faster. Actually, the reason being, I think to be honest, most of the EV is captured relatively fast until you actually move up in stakes, past like mid stakes or so. Um, Unless you're like, I don't know where the point would be, but at some point it makes a lot of sense to learn PLO. So now you have options to get to play quite a few soft games. Like if you have no good games to play, it really makes like a load of sense to learn PLO. And I know
Yeah.
that the PLO tournaments are far softer than the no limit tournaments, um, or that matter.
Yeah,
But
it's also it's interesting because in PLO tournaments, the all the best PLO players are strictly not tournament players. So you get a lot of people that are like these sicko PLO players, but they just don't play tournaments. and I am sure I'm getting destroyed by them in the first few levels because they're just so much better than me. But then once you get, shorter stacked, ICM comes into play. I kind of feel okay. Um, yeah, it's an interesting sort of environment for sure. And the mistakes that you can make in the PLO tournament are definitely bigger. And yeah, I think the edges in the current environment are a lot bigger in PLO tournaments for sure. And it's just a better game.
Yeah, a big thing that I'm thinking of in general is long-term sustainability for the poker community and what that might look like. I mean, I personally am interested in how this is going to expand into things that aren't poker. I mean, there are principles that apply for sure. Um, I guess I'll work on that later. I'm personally trying to figure out entrepreneurship now. But even zooming back to poker, uh, I think short deck might have quite a bit of value in general. I know it has value for high stakes players. What I don't know is, do you have any knowledge of what it looks like even for the aspiring high stakes player, like a mid stakes player, that kind of thing? Have you messed around with those cash games or played much stuff of that in Asia?
Not really, no, or at least not in the last little while. I learned short deck because they started running short deck tournaments at Triton's. Seemed like a pretty sweet game. There are some issues with it, especially when it comes to like bubble play. I think a lot of it should be, at least parts of the tournament should be pot limit, pre-flop. That's a whole long discussion that I don't think is worth touching. But yeah, I haven't messed around with any of the mid stakes or Asia games in recent times. But I would assume that there's some EV to be made there for sure.
My guess is there's a lot of EV at well, I mean, I played something in Cambodia and it seemed pretty damn good, but it was a turbo. I think, I don't know what kind of ROIs are possible, but I will say I had a win rate out of this world, at least in cash games. I think I ran hot though. I would just think like those two games are probably like similar-ish in EV, particularly if someone goes to Asia, the short deck's probably worth it. Um,
Yeah.
thought you might know more about that. How are your short game results? What do you, how's your feeling for your short game stuff in the Tritons and all that?
Uh, I mean, it's just been so funky with the turnouts lately. So it's really hard to evaluate. Like, um, yeah, we were talking about kind of like the ebbs and flows in terms of like the polarity of the player pool, etc. And I think right now the player pool for short decks at high stakes is at high stakes tournaments is very small and very polar. But it's polar in a weird way where I think there's probably like one or two like very very few actually tier 1 players, and then there's like a few tier 2 players, which is like probably where I would put myself. And then there's like a few people playing recreationally kicking around, but yeah, it's when you have such a small player pool, there's a lot less stability and really hard to predict edges or turnouts or anything like that.
Okay, that seems like sort of promising, I'd say. A little bit too in the Wild West. But if someone's good, that's promising. All right, I know you got to go in a second, but before you go, your top five tournament players.
Okay, so
You can be in one if you want.
no, I'm not gonna name myself. I'm
Are you
gonna
top five?
go.
Do you think you're
Say
top
again.
five or top? Are you? Would you say
Um,
you're top five or top 10 or so?
I'd put myself in the top five, but for the sake of the answer, I'm not going to, and I'm gonna pick five that are not me. So I'd say Stephen Chidwick, Nick Petrangelo, Jason Kuhn, Timothy Adams, Who else do I want to add here? Hmm. Yeah, you know what? I'll add myself.
All
Never
right.
mind.
Subtle shots fired to everyone who's not in there, like Ike and
Oh,
Dancing
right. I
or whoever.
forgot Ike.
He didn't make it. He already lost it. He already
Oh
missed
man,
the
I
cut.
should. Yeah. Yeah. It's just been a while since I've played poker with him because I haven't gone to Vegas and he's not here in Cyprus. So yeah, that's his fault for not showing up. But yeah, I would like to revise my answer to include Ike.
Oh, I think it's too late. That would be that would, that's the draft. Um, all right, actually, I thought of one last question. I'm just curious about what else are you competitive about anything else besides poker?
um, I've picked up tennis recently because a lot of the guys that travel the Tritons and the other high rollers play. So, gradually becoming pretty competitive at that. When COVID started and there was nothing to do, I was very actively training for an ultra marathon, which I ended up running.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I still kind of train to maintain, but now that COVID's not real and the live tournament scene is up, it's just impossible to put in the amount of training volume that you need, and to also sleep enough while you're on poker trips. So I do enough to maintain as a long distance runner, but um, that's sort of like on the back burner. Probably something that I'll pick up again in a few years if my volume goes down.
Tennis does sound fun. Maybe I'll try it if there's enough tennis courts. Is a bit of the issue, and I personally need lessons I suck. But it seems like fun if you like get the technique down and all that.
Yeah, it's hard to start because you mess up a lot and you're just picking up the tennis balls a lot. But once you hit a certain threshold, it becomes a lot more fun.
For some reason, I thought you were like swam a lot. Maybe because you were like swimming in the ocean.
Um, I, I free dive quite a lot. Yeah, I love being in the water, but that's something I find very fun and meditative. Not something I'm competitive at though. One of the things.
Doesn't seem like I don't know if there's competitions of that. But anyway, thank you, Daniel, for your time, and congrats on making the top five. Hope
As decided by
I hope.
myself.
Well, forget. Ike didn't make the cut. He's been too MIA. All right. Well, see you later. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Jungle. My pleasure.